She just wanted to walk to the store in peace. But he punched her right in the stomach, trying to prove that her life was worthless. Now he will see what a husband is capable of, whose family was humiliated just because of the color of his skin. At the end of the story, leave your opinion below. And don't forget to subscribe, and we'll continue. Early in the morning, the quiet town of Willow Creek, Georgia, was bathed in sunshine. A soft breeze swayed the leaves of the old maples, casting lacy shadows on the asphalt of the deserted streets. The residents hadn't yet taken to the streets, and the town seemed so peaceful and safe that it was hard to imagine that anything bad could happen here. Amelia Jensen stood on the doorstep of the neat two-story house. Amelia Jensen was standing on the doorstep of the neat two-story house. James had been away on a business trip for a few days, and Amelia had decided to surprise him by preparing his favorite dish, baked salmon with lemon and thyme. Amelia was 6 months pregnant and was already clearly feeling the joyful movements inside. She stroked her belly affectionately and said softly, "Daddy will love it, I promise." She passed the neighbors' houses and smiled at the few passers-by who knew her as a kind and helpful woman. Amelia turned onto the main street when a sharp squeal of brakes made her wince. A patrol car stopped abruptly nearby. The glass lowered smoothly, revealing the malevolent face of Officer Mark Harris. He was new to Willow Creek, but he was already notorious for being a rough and tough man. Amelia felt a growing uneasiness, but tried to keep her composure. "ID!" The policeman barked without even saying hello. "I'm sorry, did I violate something?" Amelia tried to smile to soften the situation. "Don't you understand me? Show me your papers," he repeated more firmly, getting out of the car and coming at her like a predator. With trembling fingers, Amelia pulled out her wallet and handed him her driver's license. Trying to keep her cool, Mark barely glanced at the document and tossed it back to her. "Where are you going? What's in the bag?" He questioned her with obvious contempt, looking her over from head to toe. "To the store for groceries," she said quietly, her voice trembling with fear. "Liar!" Harris suddenly roared and stepped forward sharply. Amelia instinctively recoiled, trying to protect her stomach with her hands. But he pushed her away roughly, making her lose her balance, and then kicked her viciously right in the stomach. Amelia collapsed to the pavement, feeling her consciousness drifting into darkness as the screams of horrified bystanders echoed around her. Before she lost consciousness completely, she managed to whisper only one word: "Help." The screams of eyewitnesses broke the silence of the sleepy morning, turning the street into a scene of tragedy. The residents who had fled at the noise watched in horror as Amelia lay unconscious on the cold pavement. Her face was pale and her arms unconsciously clasped around her stomach, as if in a last-ditch effort to protect her child from the cruelty of the world. Officer Mark Harris looked around nervously, but his eyes remained cold and indifferent. He straightened up, adjusted his uniform, and, ignoring the crowd's indignation, through a stern voice, "Get out of here. There's nothing to see here. The police will take care of it." But his commanding tone now sounded weak, almost pathetic amid the growing anger of the witnesses filming the incident on their phones. An elderly man stepped forward from the crowd and in a shaky voice shouted toward the officer, "What the hell are you doing? You almost killed a pregnant woman. This is going to cost you your career." Harris grinned contemptuously, not answering, but there was a flicker of doubt in the depths of his gaze, and he hurried away to the patrol car. In the meantime, some had already called for an ambulance, and soon the shrill howl of sirens filled the street, promising help, but delayed by agonizingly long seconds. The medics quickly ran over to Amelia, carefully moved her onto the stretcher, and checked her pulse. The rescuers' faces were tense, betraying the seriousness of the situation. The eldest of them glanced briefly at the crowd and ordered, "Get to the hospital now. Every minute is worth more than gold right now." Amelia was urgently loaded into an ambulance, which sped off, leaving a crowd of whispering witnesses behind. Meanwhile, in the office of a large company hundreds of miles from Willow Creek, James Jensen, Amelia's husband, was conducting an important business meeting when his phone suddenly buzzed, breaking the focused atmosphere of the conversation. Glancing at the display, he saw his neighbor's name and felt his heart clench uneasily with a bad feeling. Hastily apologizing to his colleagues, He stepped out into the corridor and answered in a voice trembling with excitement. "Hello, is something serious?" The woman's voice on the other end of the line sounded strained, barely holding back tears and fear at the same time. "James, come home immediately. Amelia has been taken to hospital. She was badly beaten by a police officer." His roommate's words were like icy needles stabbing into his heart, making him breathless with pain and shock. What exactly had happened? Why did the police attack Amelia? James said in a near whisper. Try to regain control of his voice. "It's very bad. She was unconscious when they took her away." The neighbor replied in a broken voice. "It was a new policeman. They said he had a long history of aggression towards our residents." James exhaled convulsively and disconnected the call, instantly deciding to return home as soon as possible. He hurriedly packed his things, apologized to his colleagues, and left the office, leaving no time for questions or clarifications. Only one desire burned in his eyes: to be by Amelia's side and do everything he could to protect her. But no one around James, not even Amelia herself, knew about his real past. Years ago, he had led a completely different life, far from the routine work of a manager in a large company. At that time, James worked as an operative in the Secret Service, dealing with the most complex secret missions, which often appeared on the edge of the law and morality. Tired of his double life, he left the service, carefully hiding his past from all but a few close friends from his former entourage. Sitting in a cab headed for the airport, James mentally went over the names of people who could help him understand the situation. He was well aware that official channels could be ineffective, especially if there were powerful people behind Officer Harris. Thinking back to his old contacts, James had already begun to compile a list in his mind of who he could turn to for support if the situation got out of hand. Mentally, he made a promise to himself that he would never allow his family to be put in danger again, no matter what the cost to him. When James finally reached Willow Creek Hospital, the tension inside him had reached a critical point. The corridor seemed endless, and every step he took echoed off the cold walls of the hospital, adding to his sense of unease. He felt the slanted glances of the nursing staff, used to seeing mostly white faces within these walls and rarely encountering African-American families. It was a familiar backdrop in the small southern town, and James had long ago gotten used to ignoring such glances, but today they were especially cutting to the heart. Her friend and neighbor Erica stood outside Amelia's room, her eyes reflecting a deep fear mixed with distrust and pain. When she saw James, she took a quick step toward him, holding back tears as she hugged him tightly. "James, the doctor said the situation is serious." Her placenta detached after the impact. Her voice trailed off. "They're fighting for the baby's life." His body stiffened instantly, and a rage ignited in his chest that he had never felt before. James felt powerless in the face of such blatant injustice, when the only reason for police brutality was the color of his wife's skin. His anger was mixed with the realization that these things happen all the time, but this time it was his family that was the victim. Finally, the door of the room opened, and the doctor walked over to him, trying not to look him directly in the eye. "Your wife is stable now, but we had to rush her into surgery. The baby was born prematurely and is in the NICU under close observation." The doctor's words had not sounded warm, and James noticed how the doctor was avoiding unnecessary explanations and trying to end the conversation, as if he wanted to leave as quickly as possible. At that moment, he felt again the distance that racism had always created between him and the world around him. Sitting down next to his wife's bed, James gently took Amelia's hand, whispering softly, "I'm here for you, honey, it's going to be okay. I'm not going to let them cover this up." Squeezing her palm, James was already planning his next steps, knowing one thing for sure: this time he wouldn't stay silent and forgive. James walked out of the hospital room, leaving Amelia resting after the difficult surgery, and headed straight for the Willow Creek police station. He was determined to get justice and demand immediate punishment for the guilty officer. However, as soon as he entered the gray concrete building, he immediately felt the stares of the police officers, full of hidden distrust and poorly disguised contempt. His skin color was like a red flag here, causing automatic tension among the officers. The officer at the front desk took one look at James and asked coldly, not even trying to hide his irritation, "What can I do for you?" There was a clear unwillingness in his voice to deal with an African American, especially one who had come complain about their co-worker. James endured the hard stare and answered calmly, though anger was gripping him inside. I'm here to file an assault report on my wife, Amelia Jensen, who was beaten by your officer. It happened this morning, and there are plenty of witnesses who will testify to her innocence. The policeman sighed defiantly, slowly picked up his notebook, and began to write down the information with apparent indifference. Then he looked up and said, without any sympathy, Officer Harris has already filed a report stating that your wife was acting aggressive and he had to use force. There's an internal affairs investigation pending, Mr. Jensen. James felt as if he had been slapped in the face. He realized that the system had decided in advance to acquit the perpetrator and blame it on another aggressive African-American woman. His fists clenched and his voice trembled with indignation. My pregnant wife couldn't be a threat to an armed policeman. You really think anyone's going to believe that crap? There was no response, only silent contempt in the officer's eyes, and James realized that there was no use looking for the truth here. He stopped, tried to regain his composure, and immediately dialed the number of an old friend from his past life, realizing that justice in this city would have to be obtained by other, less legal methods. When James returned home late that night, he went straight to his office and locked the door. The room was in semi-darkness, barely illuminated by the dim light of the desk lamp, creating an atmosphere suitable for revisiting a long-forgotten past. Carefully hidden from view, it held dozens of secrets that James had sworn years ago not to reveal to anyone. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out an old metal briefcase covered in a thin layer of dust. Inside were passports with false names, encrypted thumb drives with vital information, and a CIA identification card with his real name, which he hadn't spoken in years. Looking at the ID card, James felt the fire of determination and cold fury that he'd felt during the most dangerous missions reignite in his chest. Realizing that there was no legal way to get justice, he pulled out a smartphone from his briefcase, a smartphone designed specifically for emergencies. A few minutes later, he was on a secure line with his former partner, a man he could rely on even in the most desperate situations. Rick, I need your help. James' voice sounded calm but firm, without a shadow of doubt. They almost killed my wife, and the police are covering for this bastard just because we're black. There was silence in the receiver for a second, and then Rick's low voice answered confidently. Roger that, James. Send me all the details on this officer, and I'll make sure his dirty deeds can't be kept secret any longer. James finished talking and looked carefully at the photograph on the table in front of him. It was Amelia, smiling so brightly and sincerely that it made James's heart clench with pain and rage. He swore to himself in that instant that no one in this town would ever again be able to harm his family with impunity. From now on, he would make sure that the criminal and those who covered for him would pay for what they had done. The next morning, Officer Mark Harris awoke to the strange feeling that someone was watching him closely. The usual self-confidence that usually accompanied him every day had suddenly evaporated, giving way to an inexplicable anxiety. As he went to the front door to pick up a fresh newspaper, he noticed several neatly folded envelopes lying right on his doorstep. Each one was without a return address and looked as if someone had purposely wanted to draw his attention. Opening the first envelope, Harris felt a cold wave of terror sweep over his body. Inside were photographs and printouts of documents showing his past abuses of power. In some of the photos, he recognized people he had previously insulted, intimidated, and brutally detained, believing that no one would ever dare to charge him. Mark felt a cold sweat slowly run down his back, realizing that someone was methodically gathering dirt and watching his every move. At the bottom of the envelope was a small note, the words of which seemed to him almost a sentence. We know everything. You can't hide. When he read it, he felt panic sweep over his mind, because for the first time in his life, he was faced with the fact that he was now a target himself. Mark tried to call his colleagues to find out who might be behind this, but his phone suddenly stopped responding to any commands, the screen going off and on, as if someone was controlling the device from the outside. When Harris went to the window, he saw an unfamiliar black sedan slowly driving past his house. The tinted windows made it impossible to see the faces of those inside, but the officer clearly sensed that his life would never be the same again. Harris had always been accustomed to feeling superior, especially to African Americans, whom he despised and considered weaker than himself. But now that the roles of hunter and prey had abruptly reversed, Mark realized that he would have to pay a much higher price for his racist actions than he'd ever imagined. Within days, the entire Willow Creek was already buzzing with outrage over the videos of the brutal attack on Amelia. Social media literally exploded with the hashtags #JusticeForAmelia and #StopRacism, drawing the attention of people far beyond the small southern town. Crowds of protesters, including many black activists and white anti-discrimination advocates, gathered in front of the police station demanding that Officer Mark Harris be fired immediately and prosecuted. Under the pressure of public outrage and threats from unknown people, Harris was forced to appear in front of journalists and residents of the city. He walked onto makeshift stage in front of the precinct, shaking with nerves and barely controlling his own emotions, as for the first time in his life, he felt he had lost control of the situation. His face was pale, his gaze avoiding the cameras and the stares of the angry crowd, which was now clearly not on his side. Harris took a deep breath and said the words, which came with great difficulty, and each confession sounded like a blow to his own ego. "I admit that I exceeded my authority and showed unjustified cruelty to Mrs. Amelia Jensen. I did wrong, and that decision was motivated by " he paused, as if hesitant to continue " motivated by racial prejudice, of which I am deeply ashamed." The crowd murmured, expressing both surprise and indignation, for such confessions were rarely heard from the mouths of white police officers. James stood in the front row, holding tightly the hand of Amelia, who had recently been discharged from the hospital, their gazes meeting with the perpetrator of their suffering. In James's eyes, Harris saw the cold, ruthless determination of a man who had gotten to the truth. The officer swallowed hard, suppressing a panic attack, and continued, "I am resigning, leaving the police force immediately, and I promise to cooperate with the investigation that has begun regarding my actions. I hope that my confession will be the first step towards justice." Harris took a step back and walked quickly inside the building, avoiding answering the reporter's questions and leaving behind in the hum of voices of people who were just beginning to realize the magnitude of the changes that had taken place. James squeezed Amelia's hand quietly, feeling hope for change in their hearts for the first time in years. When Amelia and James returned home after Officer Harris's resounding resignation, an unaccustomed silence hung in the air of their home, saturated with thoughts and doubts. Amelia sank slowly onto the couch, closed her eyes tiredly, and, lightly stroking her belly, asked thoughtfully, "James, I still can't understand. Why did he suddenly publicly admit his guilt and walk away? I can't believe that a man like that would suddenly have a conscience." James looked at his wife carefully, trying to hide the emotions that could reveal too much to her. He felt that now was not the best moment to tell her what part he had played in this confession of Harris's, involving old connections from his secret life as an operative. Instead of a direct answer, he took her hand gently and spoke calmly. Sometimes people only do the right thing when they're up against a wall. He realized that the truth would come out either way, so he chose the lesser of evils. Amelia thought about his words, but there was still a slight look of disbelief and confusion on her face. She knew that James was hiding something important from her, and it was clearly related to his past years, which he rarely spoke about. She looked up, scrutinizing her husband's face, and asked quietly, "Whatever you did, James, I'm grateful. But don't think I don't realize how much effort and risk it cost you." He smiled slightly, realizing that Amelia was guessing more than he'd intended. For a second, he wondered if he should tell her the truth about his past work and how he'd gotten Harris to confess. But he immediately realized that the family's peace of mind and safety were worth far more than absolute honesty at this moment. He kissed her gently on the forehead and added in a whisper, "Believe me, Amelia, I would do anything to protect you and our baby. And I'll do it again if I have to." She smiled weakly in response, feeling the warmth of his sincerity and at the same time realizing that the fight for justice was far from over. They both realized that racism would not disappear after one public confession, but this small victory was the beginning of a great journey toward change. A few days after his public confession, Harris was beginning to think that the worst was over and that life would gradually return to normal. He was almost certain that his remorse, albeit forced, would be sufficient atonement to protect him from further trouble. But that evening, on his way home from the supermarket on the outskirts of Willow Creek, Mark suddenly felt someone following him, silently but insistently stalking his every step. He turned around sharply, trying to make out a pursuer, but all around him was an empty, poorly lit street. Harris's heart beat faster, and his breathing became deep and rapid as he quickened his steps, trying to get to his house as quickly as possible. But suddenly a tall man in a dark hood, whose face could not be seen in the darkness, emerged from the shadows of the alleyway in front of him. Before Harris could react, the stranger kicked him in the knee with unexpected dexterity, causing the former officer to fall to the cold pavement. "Did you think you were just going to walk away?" The stranger spoke in a low, icy voice, leaning closer to frightened Harris's face. "It's a reminder that there's a price to pay for everything, especially for racism and cruelty." Then the man retreated sharply into the darkness, vanishing into the silence of the night as quickly as he had appeared. Harris lay on the ground, breathing hard and holding his leg, which throbbed with pain. He realized that the injury was not fatal, but it was serious enough to put him out of his routine for a long time and to rob him of any sense of superiority that he had enjoyed so much before. At that moment, Mark Harris realized for the first time that he would have to answer for his actions not only to the law and society, but also to those he spent years humiliating, considering them weak and defenseless. His world had finally collapsed, and the realization that he was no longer safe was a worse punishment than the physical pain of the blow he had received. Thanks for watching. Leave your opinion below and don't forget to subscribe